overall funding provided for Indian Affairs would be lower than any level in the last 15 years. 15 years. Nearly every line item in the budget has reductions. The almost $500 million in total cuts is the largest of any bureau at the Department of Interior. We have to do better, Secretary Zinke, and I hope that you will work with this committee to start over and fulfill the commitment that we have made to these communities. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Bishop, thank you for holding a hearing earlier this year on our Bipartisan Jobs for Tribes Act. As you know, the bill would be a major economic boost for Indian country and would support increased commerce between tribes and indigenous peoples across the Western Hemisphere. Mr. Secretary, during our hearing on the bill, the Director of Bureau of Indian Affairs told us that in general, Interior supports the legislation, but that we need to make some technical tweaks. We're open to that. The director gave me his word that the Interior would provide technical feedback on the bill as soon as possible, but that was 2 months ago, sir. Secretary Zinke, do you have a timeline for when you can get comments back to this committee?
I don't have a timeline, but I'll make it a priority, and when I get back, I'll have a meeting today about it.
I appreciate you making a commitment to that. Offshore drilling in California, I want to go back to that. Mr. Secretary, you know the strong opposition that Californians have toward more offshore drilling. I like to emphasize that it's not just theoretical for us, that we have seen firsthand the Santa Barbara blowout and the Refugio oil spill. Our goal is to get these platforms removed, not give them a new lease on life. Now, Florida, who also opposed the administration's plan, got an exemption. So why can't California get an exemption other than being a blue state and Florida being a red state? Why are we so different?
Couple things. Florida did not get an exemption. In the case of Florida, 3 things. One is every member, both sides of the aisle, wrote me a letter. Second is the governor asked for an immediate meeting. And third, there's a little thing called a federal moratorium that expires in 2022, but that federal moratorium extends well past 100 miles off the coast.
When you say both sides of the aisle wrote you a letter, are you saying that the GOP California representatives did not send you a letter?
Both sides of the aisle, that every member of the Florida delegation, both Republican and Democrat, either wrote me a letter or wrote me a statement in strong opposition to drilling off the coast of Florida.
So are you saying that California Republicans failed to send you a letter talking about the importance of shutting off oil drilling off of California coast?
No, what I'm saying is that Florida, the reason why, and I could have put Florida off the list in the beginning because the executive order from the president didn't specifically look at Florida, but had I left Florida off, it would have been arbitrary and capricious.
Thank you. I want to make sure.
My commitment to California, and I'll say the same thing I said to your Governor Brown, is that at the end of the day, this president wants to take in consideration of local communities, of the state, and as we go through, and this happens every 5 years.
Just for the record, in the last 30 seconds, I want to make sure that we understand that if the president wants to preserve Mar-a-Lago's ocean view, that he should also be looking to preserve his Los Angeles club. Regarding the water needs in California, we have a vast underground aquifers, specifically in Southern California, the area that I represent, but we are in great need of funding because that water is severely polluted by federal contractors that came in, polluted, and then left. My time's up, and I yield back.
Thank you. Let me interpose myself now with a few questions, if I could. First one, Secretary Zinke, is actually not really a question, but more a confusion that I happen to have. if, as I have heard, California opposes federal action on federal waters, and Florida opposes federal action on federal waters, and any other state opposes federal action on federal waters, why, when Utah was opposed to federal action on federal lands on Bears Ears, did it go through anyway? Or when everyone in the Utah delegation and the Utah governor and every other assembly of elected officials in Utah supports what you did on the Bears Ears, or your recommendation on Bears Ears, why all of a sudden is that now subject to lawsuits by some groups, opposition from others, introduction of legislation? Somehow there is a disconnect here that I don't quite understand of why it's okay for some people to object to it and not for others. Why it's okay that public lands and public waters are treated differently, or that one set of public area is not the same kind of set of other public areas. I don't think you can answer that, because I don't think there is a logical answer. It's just I wish there was some logical consistency in what we're doing. And if indeed we want to allow local governments to have a say in how their land are doing it, allow that same thing to happen in my state as well. Actually, allow it in my state first, and the rest of you can go screw yourselves. I don't care. Just so my state, I actually get it. Secretary, let me go to your infrastructure fund, if I could, for a second. Last year, we passed a Centennial Fund, and the biggest problem we have, I mean, it's doing a wonderful job. The biggest problem we have is actually finding a continuous stream of revenue to go into that particular fund. Can you go once again with your proposal for an infrastructure for backlog improvement funds, and why you're trying to do that again?
The buildup and infrastructure of our park system, which is about $11.6 billion in backlog. The last great effort to build our parks was Mission 66, is from 56 to 66. And I'll agree that there's some good things that came out of Centennial, but the problem with the Centennial is nothing really substantial to address $11.6 billion. It had some nice programs, Find Your Park. It had some development in National Park Foundation, which is good, but there's nothing of weight to address $11.7 billion. So looking at it, our bill proposes this. On new energy set at last year, is that net dollars going to Treasury. It's important that we say net dollars into Treasury, because many of you enjoy LWCF or Go Mesa, and we understand, and I didn't want to get toe-to-toe.
Well, wait a minute, let me interrupt you for a second. You need to find a revenue source that's big enough to actually make a difference. I mean, we can have cake sales all the time, it's not going to make a difference, and I appreciate that. But I also have some confusion, because some people have labeled this proposal of you as backwards, a sham, inaccurate, although at the same time, they like LWCF, what you just said. The LWCF money comes from offshore revenue. This program comes from offshore revenue. Is it possible that there's actually good oil and bad oil, and we need to make a difference between them?
Well, Mr. Chairman, this proposal comes from all energy sources, to oil and gas, wind, solar, everything that is energy produced on federal lands. That's the source of this revenue. We don't judge energy. Policy of this president is all the above, recognizing that we have to power this country, and energy dominance is a national security. Morally, it is right. Environmentally, it is right. And economic, it is right. It is better to produce energy in this country under reasonable regulation than watch it be produced overseas with no regulation.
So you will establish a baseline of what has been produced in the past that will fund the programs that are already there, and then anything that can be increased from that, that becomes what will be going to your backlog program.
And we believe that's correct, because in many places it has been punitive and not allowing energy development to occur where appropriate on public lands. We are seeing a rise on offshore. We're seeing a rise on BLM land and permitting, and we're trying to address the permitting to do it.
I'm giving you 20 seconds or less here. Tell me how your reorganization effort will help the level of service given to people. You got actually 17 seconds.
Well, given that, the drawing of what we're currently organized with, and the next slide of that, this is based on science, and if we focus on recreation, NEPA, and permitting, and we force structurally for the departments to work together, we'll have better outcomes sooner.
And I'm out of time. Thank you. Ms. Ms. Hanabusa, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Secretary Zinke. I want to talk to you about a couple of very small projects in terms of your whole budget, but ones that are very significant and important, especially to Hawaii. I sit before you, the granddaughter of two internees. Both of my grandfathers were interned during World War II. One in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and one in a place called Honouliuli in Hawaii, which people did not know about. I didn't find out about the fact that my grandfather was interned on Oahu for a lot of the wartime until he was 80-something years old, because they didn't speak about it. And that's been the problem that many face. The Japanese Americans who served in World War II, as you know, probably the most decorated unit to date in the history of the military, and the 100th and the 442nd, as well as those who were interned, just did not speak about it. My grandfather was born in Hawaii, and in essence, a citizen by birth, though we were a territory then, and he did not speak about it. This president's budget zeroes out what is, I think, a really nominal amount compared to your whole budget. It's about $2 million. But what it does do is eliminates the grant program that have at least kept various institutions throughout the United States who are trying to keep this history alive, because I believe that it is essential that we as a nation recognize our darkest moments so that we don't have them repeat again. So, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to know, even with the president zeroing it out, are you committed to continue the grant programs that are identified, I believe, as the Japanese American Confinement Sites Grants Program, which were funded in 2017? Will we see it funded again in 2018?
Oh, konnichiwa.
I think it's still Ohayo gozaimasu, but that's okay.
I guess it's after 10. To your point, the priorities were set that fix the Park Service, fix our stuff first. And this program may have been caught up on that. I read about it this morning, and so I will look into it. I'm committed to understand, to making sure the importance of this, and I agree with you, it is important. We still have a grant program, but I think it probably got caught up in the priorities of fixing our, when I say our stuff, interior facilities, bridges, pipelines, and infrastructure first, before we extend grants to other programs. That's likely what happened. They got caught up on that. I will look at it, and I'll work with you on it, because I think it is important.
So can you tell me that even if the president zeroes it out, would you have the discretion to, I guess, sort of, if Congress approves it, is that what you would need, for Congress to give a line item on it, for you to override the president?
Well, the will of Congress, always on the budget, is looked at seriously. So if Congress moves, I'm sure we're going to support Congress. But you have my commitment to look at it, because I think it was an oversight in the budget, again, because our priorities were on national park operations, and this is probably one of the programs that was a result of that. I'll work with you on it and look at it.
Thank you so
And
much.
I understand the importance of it to American history.
So let me also point out two programs. Also, really, not a lot of money, but has grave impact if you cut it. One is what we call Nagpra, which is, of course, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. That's also been zeroed out. And that's very essential, as you know, when we look at artifacts and keeping the history alive of our Native peoples, including the Native Hawaiians. Will you also commit to look at that as well?
I will, and that's probably and some of these smaller grants, I'm sure that's what occurred. And I can talk to you about grants overall. We give about $5.5 billion.
That's right. So
And I did not bring in the stack of IGs with it. So there's been some problems with grants. We're trying to organize it and track things. This is the copy of the IGs. So we're trying to track the execution of them a little closer, but I'll work with you on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn, I apologize for stepping in front of you, but
Mr. Chairman, you can do that anytime you want.
I had this burning within my bosom. Sorry. You're recognized.
Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you here. What a difference a year makes. I'm excited about what you are doing, and I appreciate your efforts. 15 months ago, you were on this side of the dais asking the tough questions. Now we get to, but you were always an engaged and effective member representing Montana very well, and I appreciate our loss as a committee is America's gain. And I appreciate the fact that with increased energy revenue, we now have turned $1 billion back to states and tribes. We are fostering energy dominance. We are reorganizing. I like your ideas on reorganizing the federal bureaucracy. That there's some exciting ideas there. So you're doing some great things. Let me ask you about that reorganization. With the Bureau of Reclamation in particular, there's always been an identity between Colorado and the Bureau of Reclamation. They've worked hand in glove so many times. As these talks continue on reorganizing, will you continue to look at Colorado as a end place for some of the current Washington-based bureaucracy to go and be closer to where the projects are that are being done by the Bureau of Reclamation?
Good question, and let me tell you where we are so everyone knows in reorganization. We asked the USGS to strip the political boundaries, what it will look like to organize and manage on the basis of science, watersheds, wildlife corridors, ecosystems. They came back with 13 different regions, and then I brought every SES in, not everyone, but a selected group across the country. And these are senior executive service careers, and I asked them to take a look at closely the maps and adjust them. I took every recommendation because we have certain assets that extend past states, and the map you have before us, before you is that map. Then I coordinated with the governors. The governors felt pretty strongly out west that they wanted to maintain the BLM state directors. This organization doesn't affect it. And the governors felt pretty strongly that recreation, NEPA, and permitting were the areas that we would focus on. Interior today is 16% of Interior is retirement age. In 5 years, 40% of Interior is retirement age. So we're a fairly senior group. And there are bureaus, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, that their primary activity is out west. The other challenge we have is in some cities, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Denver, it is enormously expensive for a GS5, a GS7 to have a quality of life. So we are looking at moving, let's say, a recreation group or a NEPA group that's joint to smaller cities where they can enjoy a better quality of life, because we're going to have natural turnover. So when a GS15 retires, maybe in Washington, D.C., we can reprogram it out in the field, probably where it belongs, at a GS5. And yes, we're looking at smaller cities in each of these areas, not just the West, but in each of these areas, to make sure that our people, our young millennials that are coming in, can have a quality of life.
And I know Scott Tipton would say Grand Junction is affordable. I'll tell you, Colorado Springs is affordable compared to Denver. Let me also ask you about another subject before the time runs out: illegal marijuana grows. These are happening all over the country. I think there's bipartisan interest in getting these under control. They wreak environmental havoc wherever they take place. Plus, cartel activity is frequently involved. So I'm real concerned about it. How widespread is this problem on federal public lands, and what are you doing and can you do to combat this horrible problem?
Well, it is a problem where the growing of marijuana outdoors is conducive. Not really a problem in Montana. Big problem in Colorado, big problem in Northern California, and it's an environmental problem as much as anything, because the chemicals used are creating havoc in our watersheds. So we are looking at forming task forces. We have BLM, we have U.S. Park Police, we have BIA, we have a number of different law enforcement entities within Department of Interior, and we are looking at forming task forces to do our part to eradicate the illegal growing on federal land, which has caused an environmental issue, among other things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in previous hearings, you and I and others have had conversations about sexual harassment. It's our understanding that you plan to release an updated department-level anti-harassment policy soon. Will you agree to provide us a copy of the draft department-wide policy?
Sexual harassment, my policy is simple, zero tolerance.
Yes, sir, but will you agree to provide us a copy of the draft department-wide policy?
I think we're just about done with that. I think we're going to release it next week. I'll provide a copy to you.
Thank you.
of it.
And how will you ensure that all bureaus' anti-harassment policies are updated to meet the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission standards?
Well, that's one of the things. Up front, our survey has improved on it. I take it seriously. I was appalled at actually one of my advisory committees. A statement by one of the members that resigned was, yes, we knew about sexual harassment, but it wasn't our job to say anything.
Yes, sir, I understand that, but my question is how will you ensure that all the Bureau's anti-harassment policies are updated to meet the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission standards? Are you saying that they will meet those standards?
The way we're doing it right now is each of the bureaus has submitted their draft. Some of the bureaus submitted a stronger than others, and then we're going through with our solicitors, all departments, to make sure that we have the strongest possible standard within the different departments. That's where we're at, so I'm sure EO is a part of it, as well as making sure that the different bureaus that we're tasked have some continuity between them. And our policy in general is see it, say something. And we take it seriously. I fired 4 people. And,
Thank you, Mr.
and they told me I couldn't fire. I'll fire 400 if necessary
Secretary,
on it.
that wasn't my question. Let me move on to my next one. One of the actions that DOI took to address sexual harassment was to require all bureaus to produce action plans for addressing harassment at the bureau level. It's my understanding that those plans were supposed to have been submitted to Deputy Bernhardt within 45 days of the announcement, which by my estimation was the end of January. Will you provide a copy of those plans to me so that we can ensure proper oversight? This is especially important since my request for a hearing on the issue has yet to be honored by the majority.
We'll supply the reports, draft reports. I don't think there's any requirement to do that, working drafts, but we'll work with you if you'd like to come over and make sure.
Mr. Secretary, it's my understanding that they were due to Deputy Secretary Bernhardt within 45 days of the announcement of the policy, which would have been the end of January. Are they not done yet? Are they still in draft form?
Well, first of all, that was my direction. So second of all, we have copies of
Are
it.
they not done yet, Mr. Secretary?
They are being reviewed.
So they're not done yet. Is that the case?
Is there a final copy, final form? No.
All right. Mr. Secretary, NASA, the military, business leaders, local governments, and countless other Virginians have vocally opposed offshore drilling in Virginia's waters, and that has been done on a bipartisan basis. Why has Virginia not received the same consideration that you've offered other coastal states, particularly Florida?
And what consideration would that be, sir?
Not having offshore drilling off our coast and taking us off the
Virginia has
list?
received the same consideration as every other state. All states are still in the process, although I did commit with Virginia to make sure there's no oil. I've committed to no new oil and gas platforms off the coast of Florida, primarily because of 3 reasons. One is because every member contacted me, the governor asked for an immediate meeting, and there's a federal moratorium that would prevent me from conducting oil and gas operations off the coast, on the basis of the coast of Florida. On the basis of that, I committed to it. Other states I have committed to. I've talked to every governor I have talked to almost every member, and we're committed to make sure our plan reflects the interests of the local communities. I can tell you most of the congressional districts on the coast are opposed to it, with a few exceptions. The governors on the East Coast, other than Maine and Georgia is on the fence, on the East Coast, the governors are all opposed. The West Coast universally is opposed along the coast. And that's where we sit on the plan.
Okay, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for your leadership and for your service. I want to try to hit 5 points real quick, as quickly as I can, and then get your comments on it. First of all, for our Chesapeake Bay cleanup efforts, critical efforts, it's critical the relationship, the partnership we have with the federal government, especially Department of Interior agencies, are key to making sure that cleanup takes place properly. As we go through the budgeting process this year, there'll be a lot of debate about where the dollars go into those Bay cleanup programs, so I hope to have your leadership and support to highlight the importance of those federal-state relationships, especially related to Department of Interior departments. Secondly, in the Chesapeake Bay, an area on the Rappahannock River, arguably the highest priority conservation site is a place called Fones Cliffs, has the greatest concentration of bald eagles in the continental United States. Appropriation goes back to 2009. We have a willing landowner, willing conservation partners. I hope that you'll work with me to make sure that we finally get this land into the refuge system that we've worked on for years and years. So I appreciate, hopefully, your consideration there. Thirdly, H.R. 3979, you talked about giving additional dollars this year for infrastructure. H.R. 3979, Keeping America's Refuges Operational Act, that I put in with Hakeem Jeffries, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, to make sure that we are continuing the volunteer and community partnerships that happen with our volunteers to maintain refuges. I think that's absolutely critical, so hopefully we'll have your support as it makes its way through the Senate. It has passed the House, it's awaiting passage in the Senate, so your leadership there will go a long way. I want to highlight, too, the importance of our regional fishery management commissions. I want to thank you so much for your leadership and commitment to objective, fact-based management decisions there, and what U.S. Fish and Wildlife did last year in decisions on Atlantic Menhaden. I think those things are critical going forward, so I hope that that continued effort there on a commitment to science-based fisheries management decisions in the maritime jobs and communities that go along with it will continue. Lastly, we were just able to get through, and the President signed H.R. 984, which is our Virginia Tribal Recognition Bill that now fully recognizes the 6 first contact Virginia tribes, the ones that provided the opportunity for Captain John Smith to survive. That is a good thing. Recognition long overdue. Thank you. In this year's FY19 budget, you included $961 million for the initial federal support for those newly recognized Virginia tribes, and I ask for your leadership in securing those dollars as we have the debate through the budgeting process. So, Mr. Secretary, the remainder of the time will be for you to comment back.
Well, on the tribes, congratulations on your successful navigation with that and your support of it. I know we're supposed to do an event, and the White House is involved with it, so we're working to coordinate that. The budget does include $960,000 for that. As they're going to be recognized, I wish them well with that. Other than that, no, on the list, I'm aware of every one of the issues we're working on. Chesapeake Bay is obviously a concern with that, and it has been for a long time. Yeah. So we're seeing some improvement in Chesapeake Bay, which is a good thing. We've seen some species recover, so I think the path for Chesapeake Bay is looking much better than it was a few years ago, and that's why we have regulation, and so I'm optimistic about it.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for your leadership there. Again, that Fones Cliffs property, I think, is a really key element of what we've been working on there for years for that whole area of the Chesapeake Bay, a key element, a very unique part of the ecosystem there that is like no other place on the face of the earth. So your continued effort there to make sure that all the willingness that I think is occurring there, both within your agencies and outside. I think the opportunities are there. So I hope that you and I, as well as the conservation partners, can work to make sure that we get that done here in the very near future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Brodillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Zinke, welcome. And I'm not sure if your Navy SEAL career ever brought you to Guam, but I'm taking this time to extend an invitation to come and visit our island since your agency is responsible for the U.S. territories. Mr. Secretary, I'm dismayed that the President's budget for the second time proposes to eliminate discretionary compact impact grants. Federal law mandates Guam to provide local public services to nearly 17,000 residents who are citizens of the freely associated states, and our population is only 170,000. At a time when more and more FAS citizens are migrating to Guam and other U.S. jurisdictions under the compacts, why does your department budget propose eliminating this important compact impact reimbursement for our island? If you could make it, because I just have such a few time here.
Well, as a Navy SEAL, I have been in Guam multiple times. The budget looked at priorities, and this is why it's a proposal and not a finished product on it. This is the debate between the two branches of service. I'll work with you on it. I understand how important Guam is. We had the meeting, as you know, in the skiff, which the first 20 minutes was dedicated to what's happening out in the Western Pacific. I get it, and I'll work with you on it.
Very good, thank you. Guam is facing a fiscal crisis, as are other U.S. territories that mirror the federal tax code. The governor has called our legislature into emergency session 7 times. So local public services now have been cut back, government workers furloughed, and staffing work hours have been reduced. The President's budget proposes to cut funding for the Office of Insular Affairs, assistance to the territories, by more than 11%, and proposes other cuts to Guam. Now, how do these cuts square with the Trump administration's stated goal of improving economic opportunities, governance, and quality of life in the territories?
Well, again, as a budget proposal, is not a finish. Insular Affairs was consistent with the other departments, trying to get together a responsible budget about where we spend our money, at what levels. But this is why, and you've been a champion at Guam. When I sat on this side, you've been a champion, and you continue to champion your message, and your message is being heard.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And constant concern I hear from Guam residents is that we are part of the United States, and yet we cannot vote for president. The 5 U.S. territories are excluded from the Electoral College, so we have no say in choosing our president. None than 2 of the 5 members of Congress from the territories are Republicans. So it's not a partisan issue. What is the Trump administration's position on extending full voting rights for the 4.5 million Americans living in the territories? Now, I know that this it requires an act of Congress, but what is the administration's position and your position?
That's way outside the Secretary of Interior's box. I'll ask, but you're right. This is a constitutional issue and not a executive action. I can ask the president as well. As I know there's a state visit that we're trying to organize because it's been a while for the leaders, especially out in the Western Pacific, to have an office call and a state visit with the president. We're working on that, and that would be one of the things to bring up.
Well, if I do introduce legislation, I'd certainly like your backing. Now, my last question is, and I only have a little time, under current law that 5 U.S. territories and District of Columbia split 6 ways a single state's share from the Land and Water Conservation Act. Now, this is simply unfair and underfunds our public park and recreation projects in the territories. Are you on record as supporting splitting this 6 ways?
I will take a look at. I know. Well, it's a congressionally mandated split on that. We'll look at it closely on that. I can tell you that I agree with you that out west, the further you go out, the less people see as our country supporting them, and they feel like they've been neglected, especially with the rise of China.
We have a
And we
bill.
talked about that.
4179, and which is supported by all 6 members of the territories. So I'll get with you on that, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, welcome back. I thought Mr. Huffman earlier brilliantly illustrated the problem that we face in California with respect to water. Breathtakingly bad public policy that's made it impossible for us to meet the water needs of Californians. Ironically, California is one of the most water-rich regions of the country. California's water policy, the state's policy is essentially to place severe restrictions on water usage, ration water, even in flood years, as was recently proposed by Jerry Brown's State Water Resources Control Board. When the Republicans took the majority in Congress, we set a very different objective for water policy, and it can be summed up in one word: abundance. I'm going to pose a very simple question to you, which might seem obvious, but I think it defines the difference between the parties on this issue. What do you think is better, water shortage or water abundance?
Well, you are right. The challenges in California water are multiple. And it's going to be a challenge this year. The reservoirs up north were full. There's a lack of storage. I think most people agree with that.
There's a complete lack of storage. We went through 4 years of record drought where we drained our reservoirs almost into mud puddles. Many communities were within months of running out of water completely. If you want to know what that looks like, you just have to look at Cape Town, South Africa. Then we had a year of record rainfall, and we had to open up the floodgates of those same reservoirs because we had no place to put the water. What is the administration doing to restore abundance as the central objective of both our water and hydroelectric power policy?
This administration is in support of more storage. But on Southern California, California's big. Southern California, those reservoirs never filled, because you have a drought, continuing drought in Southern California around Santa Barbara.
Well, that's because we can't pump surplus water as it heads out to the ocean to those reservoirs. The fact is, in Northern California, we have no place to put the water.
I agree. So this administration, I certainly support more storage. Shasta is an example of that.
Everybody
Raising
thinks
it
the
18
Colorado
feet would be
River is the
helpful.
big water in the river in the west. The Sacramento system is bigger. The problem is we store 70 million acre-feet on the Colorado. We only store 10 million on the Sacramento, and the rest we lose to the ocean every year.
True, and back to reorganization, you have NIMS versus Fish and Wildlife versus Army Corps of Engineers versus Bureau of Reclamation versus the state. You have a number of these entities that have differing views that is ensuring no progress on any front. And you've seen it.
And an ideology that is simply adverse to new water storage.
But I think at the end of the day, almost everyone wants the same goal. They want a healthy environment, they want clean water, they want an efficient system.
Let's go to that.
But we can't do it structurally, so we're going to have to change.
Healthy environment and move to federal lands policy for a moment. We imposed laws years ago that has made the management of our forests virtually impossible, all in the name of improving the forest environment. I think after more than 40 years of experience with these laws, we're entitled to ask how those forests are doing. You've seen the answer to that. They are dying. We set 3 overarching objectives for federal lands: to restore public access to the public lands, to restore good management to the public lands, and to restore the federal government as a good neighbor to those communities impacted by the public lands. Could you briefly tell us what the administration is doing in pursuit of those objectives?
Well, in the power of the Secretary, I signed a secretarial order mandating the active management of our forests under Interior. I've coordinated that with the Department of Ag, the Forest Service. Overall, this administration wants to reduce the amount of dead and dying timber, reduce the fuel load. We're going to spend, I don't know what the figures are, but probably over $2 billion last year. I think there's movement within Congress, though, because of the devastating forest fires in California, in Oregon and in Washington, and some of the groups that have historically resisted cutting dead and dying timber now look at the policy as a threat. Certainly the loss of life in Santa Barbara, Montecitos, some of these neighborhoods that have influence, watching a needless fire continue because we haven't been able to do prescribed burns, mechanical extraction, and our Forest Service holdings out west are filled with dead and dying timber. I think it's time to act, and this body can be enormously helpful in that effort.
Thank you.
Members, I have